All right. I did a brief video on the Freddie Gray case where the officers had all of the charges dropped against them, and I'm ticked off at MSNBC regarding their coverage of this. I understand that the news conference that Marilyn Mosby gave occurred at the same time that the Donald Trump press conference occurred. And I understand why MSNBC stayed with the press conference all the way through to the end. What ticked me off was that they did not turn around and air the press conference. And I was watching MSNBC all day long, and they never aired it. They finally, after about 4 hours, gave a couple of bits and pieces of it. But you're going to see more of that press conference in this video than you probably were able to see all day long. Here we go.
Folks, shocking developments out of Baltimore, where Marilyn Mosby, the state's attorney, has dropped the remaining charges against the officers accused from the death of Freddie Gray. As you recall, 3 other officers were acquitted. 1 had a mistrial, but as a result of those last 3 acquittals, it was clear from Mosby's perspective they would not be able to get a conviction off of the other officers. Yesterday, she had a fiery news conference. Here's some of it right now.
Today, Baltimore finds itself at the epicenter of a national conflict between urban and rural populations of color and the law enforcement agencies that are sworn to protect and serve them. I have decided not to proceed on the cases against Officer Garrett, Sergeant Alicia White, or to relitigate the case against William Porter. As a mother, the decision not to proceed on these trials, on the remaining trials, is agonizing. However, as a chief prosecutor elected by the citizens of Baltimore, I must consider the dismal likelihood of conviction at this point, the judicial economy in proceeding further, and the divisive impact that continuing this prosecution could potentially have on our community. As officers of the court, we must respect the verdicts rendered by the judge regarding the ultimate culpability of the adjudicated officers involving Freddie Gray's death as final, no matter how much we may disagree with his rulings. We do not believe that Freddie Gray killed himself. We stand by the medical examiner's determination that Freddie Gray's death was a homicide. However, after much thought and prayer, it has become clear to me that without being able to work with an independent investigatory agency from the very start, without having a say in the election of whether our cases proceed in front of a judge or a jury, without communal oversight of policing in this community, without real substantive reforms to the current criminal justice system, we could try this case 100 times and cases just like it, and we would still end up with the same result. Never again should an officer exhibit a blatant or reckless disregard for human life due to the fact that there are now use of force policies that emphasize the sanctity of life, accentuates de-escalation, and requires that officers intervene if fellow officers cross the line.
Officer Garrett Miller, Officer William Porter, and Sergeant Alicia White would have likely stood trial with the same judge who acquitted the other officers. I spoke to a number of people here at the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia to get their reaction to Mosby's decision.
The prosecutor's decision to drop these charges does not let the police department off the hook. It does not let the administration off the hook. And in fact, it increases the degree of responsibility to provide administrative relief, to provide other ways in which policy relief that the concerns of the community can be addressed.
I think that people should be very positive about the fact that there was an arrest, there was a trial, and there was a decision. That doesn't usually happen. And I want to compliment your district attorney because it took courage to seek that arrest. It really did.
As an activist, it's frustrating to find yourself in a situation where the only thing left to charge is the van. And the reality is that we gotta fix this. We've got to look at what policies need to be passed. We certainly need to follow up and make sure that officers who are involved in putting a man in a van and bringing him out as a corpse get fired.
I think the DA did as much as she could, but it shows you that the system itself
is leaning, is tilted toward always exonerating police officers.
Well, upon something that hasn't been done before, and I think it sent a message to the bad police. We support the good ones, and they're more good than bad, thank goodness. But the bad ones ought to know now that there are going to be prosecutions, that you will have to be like anybody else. Hire a lawyer, defend yourself, stand a trial. And if that does nothing more than sensitize police to the fact that we really have to think here before we react, that we've got to make sure that we're treating people with dignity, that we have to make sure that we are not violating the laws ourselves. If police do that even 10% more than they've done it so far, is a significant victory for her and for this process.
When Amber died, we get an Amber Law or we get a Brady bill, but there is no Tamir Rice bill that's been passed. There is no John Crawford bill, or that's why people are saying Black Lives Matter, because we've been left behind. And so that's when people begin to say, well, what about this system? And when they start to lose trust in the system, that's when people start to hit the streets.
Once again, enough is enough, and look at how our criminal justice system is structured, and address the structural and institutional bias and racism in the system. I mean, we need special prosecutors, we need grand jury reform, we need to enhance funding for community policing, we need implicit bias kind of training. We need to get the guns off the street and pass some of these gun safety measures.
When we come back to Philadelphia.
All right, so I wish that I had been able to catch that press conference in its entirety before I had made the previous video about this, because basically what Marilyn Mosby is saying is the police investigators, that investigation which she had to incorporate into her game plan, was woefully insufficient. And I hope that we are able to incorporate some type of a national policy where there is an independent investigation in all police deadly shootings. Scratch that. Into all police shootings that on the surface appear to be unjustified. Now, obviously, if somebody's shooting at a police officer and he shoots back, there's not a whole lot of need in that particular case to get deeply into the weeds. That's self-defense. Okay, that is true, being in fear for one's life. But when you have situations like this, okay, situations like Tamir Rice, situations like John Crawford, and there is no accountability, that's when we're going to have issues. We understand that the police do have a job that at times can be dangerous, and we recognize that. But we also need to recognize that police are employed because of their judgment. And when you're working in the private sector and your judgment is faulty, there is recourse. Reprimands, suspensions, and firings. That's what happens in the private sector. It should be no different in the public sector. And when there is loss of life, there needs to be consequences where that loss of life is unjustified. And I don't want to hear that age-old adage, I was in fear of my life, because that's what a lot of these bad cops fall back to instantaneously. He was reaching for my gun, I was in fear of my life, he was resisting. We hear this all the time, but we have countless videos where we can see for ourselves that the officer should not have been in fear for his life because there was no danger. That the officer should not have been yelling, "Stop resisting," because the person wasn't resisting. That the officer shouldn't have been saying, "Stop reaching for my gun," because the person was in a fetal position trying to cover up from being struck and abused. So it's time to stop with all these excuses that prosecutors and juries swallow for no viable reason, when if an ordinary citizen had been saying the same thing, it wouldn't have held water. Freddie Gray died while in police custody. He looked like he was injured before he was even placed in that van. Now, for some reason, the police in this case were not liable for treating him like they would have treated a 1-year-old baby. I say that because with a 1-year-old baby, they would have been responsible for putting that child into a car seat and making sure that that car seat was secured. Freddie Gray was physically unable to do anything for himself, particularly since he was handcuffed. He was laid down in that van and unsecured. That alone should have been criminal. But apparently, for whatever reason, the only thing, not person, but thing, held liable in this case is going to be that van. And as we know, you can't punish an inanimate object.